So Prusa has released the Mark IV 3D printer. At the same time, Josef Prusa also put up a blog post about the state of open source in 3D printing in 2023. And as I've been looking through both of these, both the product itself and this blog post, it seems pretty clear that I think Prusa is either a little scared or having some rough times, and I think with good reason. So I'll try not to ramble during this. I do tend to kind of run on whenever I'm just kind of openly discussing something and I'm not really focused. So first up, let's look at the new Prusa Mark IV. And look, I love Prusa printers. I've never owned one, but these are the printers that I recommend to people when they're asking me, hey, I'm thinking about getting a 3D printer. What should I get? And I'm always like, just get a Prusa. It's going to work. They have everything sorted out. They use quality parts. And yeah, you'll pay a little more, but you're getting quality. You're getting something you know will work. You're getting something that has a good community. And they really do contribute a lot back to the 3D printing community. So the new Mark IV, whenever I'm looking at it, you look at the new features that it has. It says, okay, it will be faster. Now, they don't really talk about speed in terms of how many millimeters per second you can print at what like nozzle size and everything. But, it says that, they could print a Benchy on the Mark III at 81 minutes, and it would take 20 minutes on the Mark IV to do the same thing. So that's like a 75% reduction. Now, whenever you think about how that's going to translate into speed, that is roughly like 4 times faster. So that to me says probably something in the 150 to 200 millimeter per second kind of print move speed range. At least that's kind of what I'm thinking here. It may be a little faster, I don't know. Good first layers because they have automatic first layer calibration. You don't have to do live Z. Different extruder, and one of the things with the new extruder is it has this larger gear inside, and so you get more contact on the filament, so you shouldn't get filament slip with this new extruder. It also has new motors that are about twice the resolution, and so that's supposed to reduce visual artifacts. It's got, obviously a very nice interface. The new extruder design also includes a new way to switch the nozzles out. So here you can see these new nozzles with this really long heat break tube or whatever the hell that is, feed tube. You can unscrew it from the side and pull those things out. So it's kind of a quick change nozzle system. And apparently they will have like an adapter that you can use standard V6 nozzles for that. The frame is now cast aluminum instead of like an extrusion. And so that will probably be optimized for strength versus weight and rigidity and things like that. So I'm sure that'll be very nice. They're also supposed to be including pressure advance, and they've added an accelerometer port. And so you're supposed to be able to use input shaper and all kinds of stuff. So there are a bunch of pretty decent upgrades with the Mark IV. But I think they will likely have a little bit of trouble compared to the success of the Mark III. And so let me just say that, out of the gate, the Prusa Mark IV is likely a very, very good 3D printer. And the biggest problem I have is that, the 3D printing landscape has changed a lot in the past few years, especially. The reason why I always used to recommend Prusas to people is that there was a huge gap in the market. In the 3D printer landscape, you have all these cheap kind of knockoff bed slingers that occupy this space well below like $400, right? Some of the more expensive things that compete in the same price range as a Prusa, I would never recommend anybody get one of those. But if you really, really do want to spend as little as possible, down at the bottom, there were things like Creality and Anycubic. And my first 3D printer was an Anycubic i3 knockoff. And to this day, that was a bad purchase. I usually, would always tell people, yeah, you can get a 3D printer for $300, but those 3D printers had problems. They had proprietary parts. They didn't always come very well set up. It was very hard to get support for them. There were so many different little variations. There wasn't a big community for any one of them. So if you ever had trouble, you might have problems actually getting help. But then on the other end, if you wanted a good 3D printer, you were going to have to spend a lot of money. And so, back then, like Lulzbot was a good 3D printer. But I mean, you can see they're selling these things today for $5,000. Even back then, they would be like $2,500. Or you could go out and you could get something like an Ultimaker. Now, full disclosure, I actually own an Ultimaker UM3 Extended. And let me just tell you, don't buy an Ultimaker. Man, you'd want to talk about bad value. To me, Ultimakers, I don't understand how they are still so successful. Here's their cheapest 3D printer, the Ultimaker 2 Plus Connect. It's $2,750. And now it's not as capable as my old Ultimaker UM3, but that Ultimaker UM3 was like a $4,000 3D printer at the time it was made. If you look at their models, they're phenomenally expensive. The replacement version for the one that I have, again, the new S line versions, $4,500, $7,000, $10,000 if you want the full meal deal with the multi-material handler and all this stuff. And from my experience, and again, this is with an older version, so take it with a grain of salt, but the UM3, it does not print faster than anything else. It does not have better print quality than anything else. It is not more reliable or more consistent than anything else. People are paying a lot of money for these things, largely because they have really good support. But for me, somebody who's, 3D printer is out of warranty, man, I just look at this and I'm like, there's no way I could ever tell somebody to buy a 3D printer paying this much, given the alternatives that exist in the market now. So that's a whole different video, and maybe I need to make a video about why I don't understand Ultimaker's business at this point. But anyway, this was what you were looking at, right? If you didn't want a low-end printer, you were going to have to spend $1,500 at least, probably more like $2,000 plus to get a good machine. And so that's where the Prusa came in, right? This thing cost about $1,000. And it worked, and it had good parts, and it was reliable. And it just, it was the solid choice. And you just tell people, yes, save up. And you could save a little money, and you can see down here, if you're willing to build it yourself, $800. And if you're looking at spending $300 on a 3D printer, and you can convince yourself, hey, look, save up some more money. Yeah, it's, over twice as much, but trust me, spend that $800 and it will be a way better, more reliable 3D printer. And that historically was always the case. And if you wanted to spend more money, it really wasn't worth it, because those $1,500, $2,000 printers wouldn't print any better than the Prusa would. But now the landscape has changed. And so one of the big changes has been that the bottom end 3D printers have gotten quite a bit better, especially something like the Creality Enders. Look, are they knockoffs? Sure. Are they probably exploiting open source software and design a little bit? Probably. But, you get a pretty decent printer now for your $300 compared to what you used to get. Remember, we used to be running these RepRap boards with this little button click interface thing that was all terrible, and all the cheap printers had some variation of this thing. But, you look at the Creality Ender 3 now, and I mean, look at the interface, right? It's still similar, but you got a really nice interface. It's clearly a well-designed overall machine. It's not simply a knockoff. It comes with built-in bed leveling. It's got a removable print platform now. It's got all kinds of features that they used to not have. And they work a lot better. They've been sorted out. They've been making these things for years and years and years at this point, so that at this point, it's a pretty refined design. They've got 32-bit, motherboards. Everything kind of works compared to what they used to be. They're just a much nicer printer. And so it's not as hard to recommend somebody, if you want a cheap 3D printer, just go get an Ender 3, right? The newest versions are actually pretty good at this point. So the competition at the lower end has gotten much better. And so this gap to even the DIY version, which by the way isn't released yet for the Mark IV, well, it's tougher competition. Now, I would still say somebody would be better off waiting, spending their money, getting a Prusa. I do think this will be the better investment compared to those low-end printers. You are getting build quality, good parts, known commodity, and Prusa gives a lot back to the community, and I think it is worth rewarding them for that. Because, they make Prusa Slicer. They design the things that then other people take and knock off, frankly. And you're getting a better interface. You're getting a better extruder. It's direct drive. It's really a good design. And so that does make it tougher to recommend, and I think that pressure is going to eat some sales, even though I personally would say, yeah, you're probably better off getting the Prusa Mark IV. But then there is the second problem, which is I was not the only one to notice that there was a huge gap in the market and only Prusa fit in it. And of course, that means we've got to talk about Bambu Lab, because this is the real problem with the Prusa Mark IV. The fact that the Bambu Lab X1 exists. If you look at the Bambu Lab X1, it's $1,200. Well, if you want a Prusa, it's $1,100 for the pre-built. Now, if you want the one that you build yourself, you can save some money. That is an advantage, but on the other hand, if you want a cheaper printer, Bambu Lab has the P1P, which is the same 3D printer as the X1, but without the panels and with a couple of features missing, which, I don't know if anybody would really miss, like the LiDAR and stuff like that. It's got a smaller touchscreen interface. So, with that type of competition, Prusa is no longer the only one in that range from $500 to $1,500. But even that is not necessarily the problem. The real problem is, well, you see these ribbons. The Bambu Lab X1, by all regards, seems like a better 3D printer than the Prusa at this point, and that's the real problem. The Bambu Lab X1 is phenomenal. It is exceptionally high speed. It's a Core XY design, so the bed isn't moving around. It has a larger build volume. It's enclosed. It has, really fancy built-in features with some AI spaghetti detection. It's got a LiDAR sensor, vibration compensation. It's got all the features that Prusa's working on still. And by that, I mean, Prusa is advertising Input Shaper and Pressure Advance, but currently those I don't think are implemented quite yet in the firmware. It's going to be released soon, and I'd have no doubt that they will, but they're still kind of working on some of this. The Prusa doesn't have an accelerometer, but it does have an accelerometer port. Well, the Bambu Lab X1 already has all this stuff. It's already ready to go. They're printing benchies in 16.5 minutes, and, the Mark IV is advertising 20, which means, well, it's already out, and it's faster. It already has all the features built in. You can get this material system for just a few $100s. Again, it promises all the things that Prusa's promised, except for it's already out, it's already there, it's got a better core movement system, the actual kinematics are a better system for speed and everything else, and it's got a bigger build volume. And so this is one of the issues with the Prusa is, well, why would I get a Prusa at this point? If I can spend another $100, this thing's in stock, ready to go, it's faster, it's got more features. What convinces somebody to spend the money on a Prusa when this exists? And this is where the argument is, well, Prusa's open source. Bambu Labs is not. If you want spares, you're going to have to get them from Bambu Lab. If you want open source access to designs, if you want the open source access to the firmware, as far as I know, Bambu Labs has not done that, and I don't know if they plan to. Prusa is open, they contribute a lot to the community. I'm sure there are some people, and I've often wondered how much open source stuff is in Bambu Lab that they're violating licenses on. But most people are going to look at this, and quite frankly, I, even caring about that stuff, would have a hard time choosing the Prusa Mark IV over the Bambu Lab X1. The Bambu Lab X1 just looks like a much better product. I feel like the Mark IV is just not innovative enough. Now look, for $800, I still think it's a really, really great deal, but probably not the pre-built one. You know, for $1,100, if I'm going to get a pre-built, I'll be honest, I'm probably going to get the X1. Now, being somebody that might build one myself, yeah, that might induce me to get this kit, but the kit's not available to order for another few weeks. So I feel like the Mark IV is not going to be the smash hit that the Mark III was because, well, there's just a lot more competition now. There's more competition from below because the cheap stuff is a lot better, and dollar for dollar, I don't know that the Prusa's the best printer anymore, especially not the pre-built. And that leads to this blog post by Josef Prusa, where he kind of voices some of the things that I've been hinting at, and I'm kind of interpreting that as I feel like Prusa recognizes that it's tough out there and that it's probably not going to be as easy for a while. You know, Prusa as a company has been kind of the darling of the 3D printing industry for the past several years because, well, they really did just kill it, right? They had the best product for a while. And so as you read through this, and I'm not going to go into super detail because this thing's already getting kind of long, you know, they state their commitment to open source. And this blog post is all about basically how a lot of companies are abusing the open source community in 3D printing. You know, there's a reason why all these 3D printers look alike. They're all kind of knocking off very, very similar designs. And it's easy to knock off those designs because, well, it's open source. You can get the hardware designs. You can get the firmware. You can get everything you need kind of handed to you. What you have to do is manufacture it. And let's face it, China specifically has a huge manufacturing base, which has a very easy time and a lot of experience and a lot of capacity at producing things that they don't design because that's what their business has been for a long time. Stuff gets designed somewhere else, and then it's manufactured in China. They are set up to do that. So it's very easy whenever there's a free design out there for them to kick out the product because, well, they're already doing it anyway. And they can do it way cheaper than anybody else. And so Chinese manufacturing has huge built-in advantages to producing these products at low costs. Now, that comes with some problems, and I don't want to get too far off into it, but look, it's no secret that there have been a lot of problems with intellectual property rights in Chinese manufacturing. It happens with bike frames, handbags, leather goods, and even power tools, right? I mean, there's just knockoffs of everything, and the vast majority of them are being manufactured in China, again, just because there's this huge manufacturing base that's already set up to basically produce stuff using other people's designs. And let's face it, China has been pretty lax to really do any significant enforcement of international intellectual property rights. It's a thing, okay? And so reading through this blog post, it brings up some very good points, right? That things in 3D printing world are generally not patented. There's a lot of open source designs. People have contributed to the community. But this creates some problems because there really are no barriers to prevent anybody from taking these things and commercializing these designs. That's part of the principle of open source. It's free, it's available, it's open. But whenever you're Prusa, that means there's competition. Especially when you are basically handing your competitors free designs to improve their products and compete with you with a much cheaper manufacturing base. And so here are his main points, right? The standard GPL license, which our printers and software are available, is very vague. It's written in a complicated way. It's open to a lot of interpretation, right? It was developed by academics for academic purposes. And here is a very good point. Look, GPL licenses don't work for hardware. There's one thing about software that's different is, well, the product is not physical. And it's much cheaper to copy software than it is to copy hardware. And so for a long time, you know, you could open source software, but a lot of companies that deal with open source software, they don't sell the software. They sell hardware that uses the software. A perfect example of this is like Android is technically open source. People don't sell Android, they sell Android phones. Linux is open source. People don't sell Linux, they sell Linux service, so like Red Hat sells support service, or there are companies that work on Linux and produce Linux computing equipment that is designed to use Linux, but they sell hardware. And so the 3D printing community largely uses like GPL licenses for hardware, and that's just kind of weird. It doesn't really work. And part of the thing is the license technically is enforceable, but here's one of the problems. A license, a copyright, a patent, all that stuff is only as good as the willingness of someone to spend money to enforce it, because these are not criminal infractions usually. They're civil, and somebody has to sue to stop the abuse of some license or patent. And so a lot of companies are out there using open source stuff, and they're violating the licenses. They aren't making their own products that use open source software and hardware. Well, that stuff's supposed to be made open source, and they're not doing it. There are one-to-one clones, which he says do not bring anything back to the community, which is fair enough, except for I think he's wrong. They do bring access to cheap hardware to the community. And even though he doesn't gain a benefit from that, the community actually does. You get cheap test beds for stuff. You get, there's a lot of people that can't afford a Prusa. They can afford maybe an Ender V3 or something. And so I do think he's wrong. They do contribute cheap stuff. That's one of the principles of open source, is to make things available to people, and hardware is costly to produce. So cheap hardware manufacturers do contribute easy access to hardware, right? And I think that's something that I can see why he may not see it that way, because he's competing against them for his livelihood and his business's livelihood and all the people he employs. But as somebody that's not doing that and is just part of the community, well, I mean, cheap hardware is an advantage, right? I mean, it just costs less for us to do things. People are stripping copyright headers. People don't credit original authors. Contributions are not equal. Absolutely. And here's the big one. It is suspected that new commercial projects are being created based on open source project, but they are using closed code. They apply for patents on that code that can then be expanded globally. And that's a real problem, right? If you are using open source stuff and violating the license by not making your stuff open source, you are essentially stealing. But here's where some of the problems are with his proposed solutions, right? His new licensed address. And look, I don't think he's putting this out as the end-all be-all. I think he is trying to open the discussion, so please don't take what I'm going to say as overly critical. I love the dude. I think he's done great stuff. I hope their company continues to be massively successful. And again, I am kicking around whether or not I need a Mark IV, or, if my next 3D printer might be a Bambu Lab. So, new license should address these issues. If you're using some code or blueprints to bring software or hardware to market, the original code's authorship must be clearly stated on the product or in the software. Additionally, deleting copyright information from headers and history is prohibited. I think that's a great principle. I think that is probably totally unenforceable. It's a good principle, but what do you do when somebody doesn't do this? Again, unless there's somebody with money and the standing to sue them, this is completely unenforceable no matter what you put in that license. Licenses are only good as enforcement, and if you cannot enforce them, if you don't have the money to enforce them, if there is no individual with standing to enforce them, they're just worthless. And that's what we're running into with the open source community. The production of nearly exact one-for-one clones for commercial purposes is not allowed. Again, if you do this, it's probably not enforceable unless you've got money. Number two, if you put this into a license, you can't call it open source, right? Because that's what open source means, is that it's open. People can use it. This is a non-commercial license, and that's fine. But again, it's only as good as your ability to enforce it. License for manufacturing spare parts is valid for service, modification, or educational purposes. Again, how do you stop it? This is what patents are for. Patents are for hardware. One of the problems with licenses is licenses are generally not for hardware. They're for designs and they're for copyright protection, things like that. And you can license patent use to someone, but if you don't have a patent, if you're trying to stand behind an open source like license for copyright claims or stuff like that, what are you going to do? because you can't keep somebody from making a physical object unless you own the rights to that object. That comes via patents, all right, not licenses. Upgrades and additional modifications based on original parts are allowed and welcome. Again, I don't know how you'd stop it. Let's go back to this point, licensing for spare parts. Are you going to tell me you've got something open source that somebody else can't make their own spare part for and sell them? Again, for service modification or educational purposes, well, what if I want to build something out of what somebody else considers spare parts? How do you stop that? I mean, again, even if you could come up with a license that might presentably make it, illegal or something like that, if somebody is selling spare parts for maintenance, how do you keep somebody else from using those spare parts in a commercial design? Again, unless you're willing to sue them. Parts that are considered consumables can be manufactured and sold commercially after the verification by the licensor based on the presentation of samples. So you want again, all this is sounding like what he really needs is to patent things, and it just can't be open source. These things are contrary to open source. What he's describing are the protections that a patent gives you, right? You can restrict this stuff with a patent if you're willing to enforce that patent and pay money to sue people. But again, how are you going to stop this? You want people to be verified to produce consumables, thermistors, fans? Look, Prusa doesn't make their fans. I'm sorry, they don't, right? I mean, they don't make their own thermistors that I know of. So, it's not like Prusa invented heater blocks. I mean, again, some of the stuff that he's mentioning, I do think he's overstepping a little bit and claiming things should be, again, I don't know how you're going to say that somebody can't sell a replacement fan for your printer unless they go through your verification. I mean, look, verification is costly for external people. This process prices out third-party consumables manufacturers. That's basically what he's looking for. That's patent protections. You're not going to get this on a license. If a product is labeled by the manufacturer as obsolete, then the non-commercial clause is automatically terminated. Again, if there's a non-commercial clause, this is no longer open source. So I don't know how any of this is practicable in the real world. If the licensor ceases its activity, the non-commercial clause is terminated. Again, all this stuff looks like a special type of patent that expires at certain points. Or it's a patent that you choose to enforce differently and grant very broad license access to. And other people in the comments down here have picked up on this stuff too, and they've had very similar comments. And so, at this point, I understand that Prusa's in a difficult place because they are getting competed with by a lot of people who are probably using some of their designs. But that is something that goes with having open source. Which leads me to point out, maybe Prusa doesn't need to keep being open source. For his business's sake, I know that people are going to cry, but his larger customer base won't give a crap. Most people won't give a crap about open source. If they did, this thing wouldn't be selling like hotcakes because it's not open source. Look, this is your indication that people don't care that much if your product is open source design. Some people do. Most people don't. If they did, they wouldn't be buying this thing. Now, the last thing I'll address, some people may say, why is my opinion worth crap? And it's A, probably not. B, I actually do have a few pieces of papers that might give me some legitimacy, but, we don't talk about Fight Club here, so I'm not going to get into that. Third, let me share you my own experience with exactly what he's talking about. Do you see this? This right here. This is a 3D printed magwell for a Polymer 80 frame. And here's the thing. This is mine. This is my design. Because of the overlap of people that may watch my videos, you might recognize this. Because this is probably the most popular 3D printed magwell for Polymer 80 frames. And I'm the person that designed it. And here it is on eBay. And this is not me, right? This says 25 sold. These things have been up on eBay and Etsy for years. And so right here, you can see here is the original design on Thingiverse. And right here at the top, I put, whenever I release this thing, non-commercial use only. right here, license, no commercial. And this right here is the reason why I no longer give out STLs. I put up a video where I designed a 3D printed portafilter for my my espresso grinder, and some people asked, "Hey, can you release the STL?" And I said, "Nope, I don't do that anymore." Or whenever I did the single dosing hopper for that grinder, and people said, "Hey, can I use your version? Can you give me the STL?" And I said, "Nope, I don't do that anymore." Because I found out that the only way to prevent somebody from using your designs is to not give it to them. If you make it open, people are going to just take it and they're just going to go sell it. And unless you're willing to sue them, they're not going to stop. It doesn't matter what the license says. For Josef Prusa, I would say this. I appreciate how engaged you are with open source, and I would love it if you would be able to continue engaging with the open source community. However, some of the things you're asking for are just not compatible. And I'm not saying that to say that you're wrong. You're not the one that's wrong. It's just the way things are. This is part of the reason why we have private property. Private property grants rights to individuals who end up with financial incentives to protect and maintain those rights and keep those valuable rights from being destroyed. Tragedy of the commons is a real thing, and what he's describing here is a type of the tragedy of the commons. That these things that are supposed to be for all of us end up getting destroyed because none of us have the incentives to fight for them. Which means that when people take open source ideas and put it into a closed source product, well, what are you going to do about it? Nothing, because nobody has financial incentive to do anything about it. And if somebody does have financial incentive, by nature of it being open source, there's likely nothing that they can do because they don't have the right to sue somebody for using something that's open source. A lot of times, right? Now, again, get patents, man. Get patents. That will give you hooks. Then you can sue people. But if you're not going to sue them, there's nothing you can do. So anyway, that's all I got to say. I know this is probably a much longer video than anybody wanted, especially me. If you've got any feedback, right? I mean, this is an interesting topic. And it's something, that as somebody that uses a 3D printer, I hope this ends up going in our favor, but I think we are probably going to have a hard time with open source stuff. If it's open source, you have to accept people are going to use it. And for somebody that's trying to use open source ideas in a commercial process, the only way you can win is by being the best, by being more innovative. And that's where I'm afraid that the Mark IV, it's just not innovative enough to keep ahead. I think it's just getting beat a little bit. Now, I still may end up getting one, but it'll be the Mark IV kit. There's no way I'd pay $1,100 for this. It's just not worth it. Again, given that for another $100 I could get a better printer, frankly. And again, is it bad? Yeah, that other one's not open source. They're probably using open source stuff and not making their stuff open source. I get it. But, that's just the way of the world. That's how it is. So anyway, again, it's an interesting topic. If you got any feedback, leave it down below. Thanks.